story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Upbuilding the Self. I am Michael Sloyer, and I am here with my two partners, Rasanath and Vipin. Hey, guys.
Hello.
Hey, Michael.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really nice to be back in the flow of things and with you for this conversation. And so today, our topic for this podcast is meta conversations. And I'm really excited to talk to you both about this topic. And I think I can speak for all three of us when I say that this is one of the most important and probably also underutilized tools that we use in our coaching work. It's a tool that can be used to unblock frustrating relationships and really help to build environments of trust, which is at the core of our work at Upbuild. Vipin, I think it was you who introduced me to this term a couple of years back when we were working on a project with a client of ours. And so I was wondering if you would get us started by sharing what is a meta conversation and why is it so important in your work?
Yeah, thank you. Simply defined, a meta conversation is a conversation about the conversation. So the whole idea of something meta is that it's self-referential. And if I'm in a conversation with you and there's some tension, some trigger that's happening, the meta conversation is we stop talking about the thing that we're talking about and we start talking about the communication between the two of us. What's the dynamic? What's happening in the relationship? What's happening in the conversation? It's almost like we're floating above the conversation and observing what's happening and talking about that. I think about a meta conversation as a conversation about the conversation, or sometimes it may be a conversation about the relationship. And you had asked about the importance of this. In part, as I'm speaking about it, I feel like it may be self-evident. It's about being very intentional about the conversations that we're having, the dynamics, the relationships. And when you are trying to talk about content, but the relationship dynamics are off, you feel triggered, it's really hard to talk about the content of the conversation uninfluenced by those dynamics. And so what we find is it's much more effective and productive to pause the content and talk about what else is going on and then return to the content once there's more understanding.
Yeah, really appreciate that. Rasanath.
I think that one of the biggest advantages of having a meta conversation is when we are locked into the content of what we are talking about and when we are getting triggered, the typical response is to actually hit the accelerator and go even more into the content because we are trying to get something from the conversation, but it is no longer actually about the conversation. We have emotionally departed from the content of the conversation, but we are still in the content of the conversation. We're trying to get our needs met through the content of the conversation when emotionally we have already departed from it. And so what meta conversation does is it brings back the attention to, well, what are the underlying emotions that you're trying to meet from that conversation? And those are many times unspoken. And when two or more people are having a conversation, and especially a heated conversation, sometimes triggered conversation, they're not even aware that it's no longer about the content. And when you shift the energy and then bring it back to the underlying emotional needs, what's happening here? Suddenly, the conversation is more effective because you address the emotions before you actually then come back to the content again. What it also does is clears a lot of misunderstanding. It actually can create alignment on the content as soon as there is alignment and understanding of the underlying emotions behind the content itself.
Very good. Thank you for that. And so what I'm receiving from both of you is that meta conversations are about zooming out and talking about what are the needs that I really have here and what needs are not being met, rather than trying to do it in a way where I might not be as explicit about those needs.
That's right.
Okay, good. And do any examples come to mind so we can help our listeners really get a clear sense of what we're talking about here?
So many examples. I mean, I don't even know where to start. I was thinking about a conversation that we were having within our team a few months ago. It was around the new year, and I had some internal clarity about a decision. And with a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, I'd sort of emailed the team and communicated that initiative that I was taking, with also wanting to discuss it. And then Rasanath, you had reached out to me to just check in on how I was doing. I got a sense that the reaction to my enthusiastic initiative was different than I had envisioned. And it was partially a feeling that I hadn't taken the time to talk through and get alignment. And I remember at the end of that conversation, I was a little confused, and I was asking you, do you think I need to reach out to the others? And you were in a rush because you were with the kids, and you basically said, I think that would be a good idea. And then we hung up the phone. And I remember sitting there and thinking, well, if someone has a problem with what I have done, they should reach out to me. Why should I be the person to reach out here? They should reach out to me and tell me that they feel uncomfortable with something. And I remember thinking for a couple hours, feeling quite entrenched in that viewpoint, and seeing my ego saying like, okay, well, I'll just sit back and wait till somebody reaches out to me if they have a problem. And I realized as I was thinking that way, one, I myself was the only person carrying the distress in that moment. I was feeling triggered. I was feeling upset, and I was suffering the consequences of that. So my decision to say, hey, I'm going to wait, was not serving me, myself, even though I was being very egotistical about it. And at the same time, I realized I didn't want to be that person. If someone else was feeling uncomfortable, I didn't want to be the type of person that would say, well, if you're feeling uncomfortable, come to me and talk about it. This is my partner. If you feel uncomfortable, let me reach out to you to try to understand your discomfort and see how I might be able to bridge the gap in understanding. And so I did reach out to our other partner, Hari Prasad. And I also laid all of this out for him. I shared with him my feeling, what had kind of happened over the past 48 hours, what I was feeling before I made the call to him, and why I eventually did. And then we talked through sort of where I was coming from and where, I was seeking to understand what he had in his mind. And when I have this type of conversation among our team, where there's really a shared understanding of the importance of that kind of meta conversation, bringing understanding and alignment, it really is a release and a relief. And I found we both understood a lot more about where the other was coming from. It gave us a lot more compassion for the other person's, I wouldn't even call it a position, because it wasn't like a negotiation or anything like that. And I felt actually much closer to him as a result of having talked about something that was difficult. And then, by the way, the content, where there was some divergence, it was gone in an instant. Like when we really understood where each other was coming from, the content conversation became so easy.
Yeah, that whole story is so illustrative of what a healthy meta conversation looks like. And you use the term lay it all out. And I think that's really what a meta conversation is all about. It's about laying it all out, including, and probably most importantly, my own thought process and where I'm at and what I'm feeling, so that that is the thing that we can talk about rather than the content itself.
Yeah. Well, and it makes you feel vulnerable. Like I shared with him how I felt hurt by the response to my initiative. And it would have been easier for me to just say, well, if someone has a problem, come and talk to me and stay cloistered in, but yeah, it takes first to be able to acknowledge my own need in that situation and my own emotions, and then to feel comfortable, to feel safe, to be able to talk about that, to bring that into the conversation in a way that's not raw and emotional, but that is very clear and honest about what is it that we each experienced, what are we looking for, and how do we try to do this differently in the future to make our working together even more effective. I also, as we continue this conversation, I thought of another example that is, it wasn't as tied up in a nice, neat bow at the end. So I don't want to leave also the impression that every time you have one of these conversations, it's just like rainbows and unicorns and everything works out beautifully. We can come back to that because I want to hear more from Rasanath.
Good. Rasanath, please.
Well, Vipin, thank you for sharing that example. I think it was very poignant. It just makes me realize how grateful I am to be working with these group of individuals that I work with every day. I just had this overwhelming feeling around the sensitivity and the maturity that the individuals in this team bring to anything in any conversation. So thank you for that. And that example that came to my mind was just last week. We have been having some sleep regression challenges with our little one. And every single day last week, my wife and I were triggering each other at night. It was just this thing where she was tired, I'm tired. And then something or the other just kept happening. And we had just arguments. And just last week, as that happened 5 days in a row, at one point in time, both of us said, like, hey, this is just happening every day. And there must be something here that we are not addressing. And the conclusion for both of us was we both are tired and we both need help. And I think the way we can have some of these conversations is actually making an ask without feeling like the other person should fulfill it. And just treating each other with a little more kindness because we both are in the same boat. And in the conversation, what we also realized is there was an internal story around how I am more tired than the other person. And that was just fascinating to discover because that is the only thing that justifies you asking for help from the other person in a way that doesn't make you feel guilty, is when you feel more tired. And for me, that discovery was just very, very helpful. And we have been adopting a different way of working in the last 3 days that one has brought in more appreciation for what the other person is doing. And even when we're making the asks, it comes from a place of actually appreciating what the other person has done through the day and how the other person must be feeling tired by the end of the day. So that was just another example of a meta conversation that was very helpful, where we stepped out of the content and tried to address the underlying emotion.
Very good. And I think this story is illustrative of one of the clues that we can use to figure out when we need to have a meta conversation. And that's the feeling of this keeps happening, or this always happens, or this never happens. When we start using extreme words like always or never, or we feel like something is repeating itself, it's probably a good opportunity at that point to take a step back and have a conversation about the fact that it keeps happening, or that I feel that this person always does something or never does something. And the other thing that you brought up, which is so good, is that when we have a story in our head about what the other person is thinking or what they're doing or what their intent is, where we're not actually sure if that's the real story, or we're pretty sure that that's not the real story, it's an opportunity to just let the other person know that that's something that's in our head and to be able to have a conversation about that.
Also, going back to what we discussed earlier about meta conversations itself, when we continue to engage in the content, when we're getting repeatedly triggered, and this is something that I discovered during the last week, it further reinforces your story. Because you sort of create a situation where the other person is stepping into exactly, it's sort of like the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where we are not stepping out and really understanding needs, but as you're engaging in the content of the conversation, the other person is showing up more and more closer to what was the story in your head, which makes things so much worse. And then at that point in time, you're just looking for justification more than actually trying to resolve what the underlying feeling is. So you are on a slippery slope at that point in time. And the meta conversation actually helps you stabilize. You want to make sure you're not on the slippery slope, especially when you're having conversations around very important things. Think about how you're having conversations about content that has far-reaching implications on the organization or on people's lives. And when we are not able to really bring in the underlying emotion behind those conversations and decisions get made, it's pretty risky.
So we've talked about a couple of personal examples from both of your individual lives. Any organizational examples that may have come up through your coaching work that would be helpful to share?
I was thinking that my example was an organizational example. It was our organization.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of one in particular. This is happening all the time in coaching because part of what we're doing is helping the person reflect on and process the relationships around them, the dynamics, the process of their decision making. And often it comes in the form of, we do a lot of work around trust. And so an example, yesterday itself, we were having a group coaching conversation with a handful of executives at a startup here in New York. And they were really frustrated with the founding team, and the morale was really low. And it was painful to hear all of the things that they were saying, ascribing intentions, a lot of gaps in understanding and gaps in communication. And they're having conversations together. They have direct reporting relationships with the CEO. So they're meeting every week. And yet we asked them, what's the effectiveness of that weekly meeting? And then on a scale of 1 to 10, the numbers we got back were 2, 3, and 4. It's like, what are you doing about that? You're meeting every week. You have all these frustrations, and the effectiveness of your weekly meeting is at a 2. You have to be having a conversation about this. And often, if it's not established that we have a way to have meta conversations in this environment, sometimes you default to not having them until things get so bad or so broken that you have no other choice, or you need to bring somebody else in to help you have that conversation. One of the greatest tools when I was a founder prior to joining Upbuild, that one of my co-founders learned through a conversation with another founder, was this idea. He gave us this term, pinch moments. It's the idea of a meta conversation. Whenever you are in a conversation, in an interaction, when you feel triggered, or you feel that somebody else may be triggered, or both, then you call it out by saying something like, I'm feeling a pinch moment here. And you stop the conversation that you're having and talk about what's pinching. And it's exactly what we've been talking about here as a meta conversation. But what that did was also it established a norm.
Yeah. You've shared that with the team before. And it's also, I think, something that we all use with our clients consistently and among one another. And this is why the power of a term like meta conversation or pinch moment is so strong, because if everyone else knows what we're talking about, we don't need to say much more than, hey, can we have a meta conversation about this? It's immediately clear that we need to stop talking about the content and we need to talk about the relationship or what's going on in the background. Or if I say that I'm having a pinch moment, which is a specific flavor of a meta conversation, then it's clear that I'm having some emotional reaction. And what I need right now is for us to be able to talk about what I'm experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I remember the first time that we used that term. And, the thing is, it's what Rasanath said, you're in this mode, there's more tension, you're jamming on the accelerator so that you can get your point across. And you're sort of sometimes brushing that tension under the rug in the effort to get what you want in the conversation. And someone calls out a pinch moment. And it's almost like a deer in headlights moment where everybody's, whoa, wait a second. Let's pause for a second and notice what's happening. And yeah, the first couple times it can be a shock to the system. We're like, wait, no, we got to keep going on this. And then you get used to a different way of working. But it is so helpful to have that language, that shared language, so that, like you said, you immediately know what needs to happen after that versus trying to reestablish that each time.
I think part of the reason why meta conversations are helpful but so rarely had is, to your point, Vipin, it's not efficient as we think about efficiency. And it's so paradoxical because when there's a lot going on and we want decisions to be made as quickly as possible, we don't want to have meta conversations because it slows everything down. We're not going to arrive at anything useful or helpful here from a point of view of decision making. And it's interesting how the whole thing becomes paradoxical. We are in crunch mode from a point of view of time. And so what we want to do is just push the accelerator harder. The challenge is that the price we pay for that and that kind of fast decision making is erosion of trust. And over time, then it starts to affect the functioning of the organization, where now I have to spend more time repairing. And usually the response to that is, well, let somebody else deal with the problem. And sooner rather than later, it leads to a culture that is dysfunctional, which is why just pausing and stepping back, even when we experience a time crunch, just the recognition that nothing is more important than really making sure that trust gaps are addressed immediately just builds a very healthy culture in the long term. And the reason why many times meta conversations aren't had, one is it's hard to stop at that time and take a step. That's one reason. The second reason is it doesn't feel efficient, but in the long term, it's much more effective.
Rasanath, what you just shared makes me think of another very important and also not so often had flavor of meta conversation, which is one around feedback. And I think this is something that we all experience where either ourselves or maybe one of our clients are coming in and complaining about another person. And there's a tendency to go on and on and on about what's not working. And then the coach might say, well, have you talked to them about that? And the common response is, I can't talk to them about that. I just don't feel like they will receive my feedback. Well, have you had a conversation about that? Have you had a conversation about why it's so hard to give them feedback? And it's usually at that point where a light bulb goes off, because by having that conversation and being able to say, there's actually things that aren't working in our relationship, but I find it really hard to be able to talk to you about those things. And I'm wondering if we can talk about why it's so hard for me to talk to you about things. That can be a really good first step towards rebuilding trust in that relationship.
Yes, that's such a good point. And it's simple. It's very simple. But the story that we build And the reinforcement of that story, when we don't have that meta conversation, just makes things harder than they actually are.
And I think usually what we find is that when we're able to talk about why it's so hard to give somebody direct feedback, that the feedback itself becomes more natural in the conversation. And it also becomes a little bit less of a big deal. Even if it's still a big deal, it softens a little bit because we're able to talk about really the thing that's in our way.
Very true.
I think at this point, it might be helpful to just offer this one other example that I had in mind, just to balance the idea that every time you have a conversation like this, the outcomes are glorious. Last summer, our family had spent an entire month with my brother's family, visiting them. We were traveling around the Pacific Northwest, and there were a few days that were leading up to a fair amount of tension between my brother and I. And we're very close. We have a really healthy, really great relationship. But, you spend a month with a family and things happen and things come up and there's things with the kids. And so one night, finally, it was like there was enough tension that had built up. We were camping somewhere. We had a campfire. Everyone else had gone to sleep. And we said, I think we should talk. And we have this conversation. And it was difficult. And I was trying to be as open and honest as possible about some of what I had been experiencing. And there were tears, there was crying. And then the next couple of days were probably the hardest that I've experienced in 10, 20 years in our relationship. And there was a lot of distance and shutdown as a direct result of the conversation we had. And then we talked about it a couple of days later. And, what my brother said to me, because I felt like I had opened myself up, and then he had responded in a way that was different than I had envisioned. This is what I was talking about before. And he acknowledged that, because I was sharing some regret about the conversation we had, even though I wouldn't have changed it ultimately. But, he said, I understand, like, if I were you, my brother's reaction to the conversation, he's like, I would have wished I'd never had that conversation. And I probably wouldn't feel very inspired to ever have a conversation like that again. And his point was, I don't feel great about how I responded, but I can't help it. That was my response. And you can't control the other person's response, which I think is such an important part of this whole conversation about meta conversations. Like, I can go in having a conversation about how I'm experiencing the conversation, the relationship, the dynamics, and really seek to understand the other person. But you may not always be met with what you're looking for. And your decision to do that can't be dependent on a certain response that I'm looking for. It's kind of the same thing when you apologize to someone and you're like, well, I'm apologizing, but really I'm looking for a certain reciprocation and I'm trying to induce an apology from the other person. And when I'm not getting the response, then I feel like, well, that wasn't really worth it. No, it's, so that was an example where it didn't go the way that I had envisioned in my mind. And I think it was still really important for us both to have talked about what we talked about, and things had gotten much better from there. And yet I still carried some dissatisfaction with how that meta conversation went. It was also an important reminder that I have to look out for what are my own expectations of this conversation. Why am I doing it? Am I doing it to elicit a certain response? Am I doing it to just share openly about what I'm experiencing and build more understanding and better communication?
Thank you. Thank you. Sometimes when we are not met with a certain response, we lose faith in the process.
Yes.
And it's like, to just draw the metaphor around prayer, which is such a big practice for us. We also talk about how a prayer will not be met with an answer the way we are expecting it for it to be. And when that happens, usually we lose faith in like, okay, maybe I should not do this anymore. And it's a very similar thing with meta conversations. I really appreciate you sharing this example and what you shared about it. I think the reason why we have meta conversations is to, one, get as close to the truth as possible, so that from that place, then we can understand each other more deeply. And also, many times when we have that conversation, we also recognize the other person is perhaps not ready to go there at this stage, which can be disappointing because we want for this relationship to grow and improve. And that's the challenge, or I should say, that's the risk that we take in the process, because ultimately what we want to do is make sure we have done everything possible to build a sound foundation for the relationship. And this is one of those things where you can never really go wrong in terms of your attempt and the process of really building a sound foundational relationship.
Yeah.
It's just important to recognize that.
Well, what's so interesting about the language you just used also is about trying to get at the truth. Actually, one of the things that happened in this example that I felt was really substantial and an inflection point in the conversation, when we debriefed about what had happened a couple of days later, one of the things my brother said was, what kind of happened was you shared a lot of stuff with me, and to quote the few good men moment, it was he said, he used the words like, I couldn't handle the truth. You shared some truths with me from your perspective, and I couldn't handle the truth. And so I had a response to that. I had a reaction to that. And even just the acknowledgement of what I was in my intention from him was so meaningful to me that, it just gave me also a lot more empathy and compassion for the past couple of days, because he was sharing very honestly about what he was going through. And that was difficult, but it was the intention, I think, for both of us was to try to get at the truth. And what actually got in his way was he all of a sudden was seeing something very different than he was aware of. And that can really throw someone off. It can be like, wait, is this really true? Is this possible? That's not how I see myself. And I think, that can be very, what's the right word? Debilitating.
Yep. It's so true. And to me, what comes to mind is when we talk about meta conversations, usually when we use a tool or a process, it's hard to divorce that from the outcome. And what's very important to recognize about meta conversations is a process of going as close as possible to truth and understanding. And sometimes it takes multiple conversations to actually arrive at that. But the process itself is very rewarding. Even when you don't get to the outcome as you might expect in your first conversation, there is suddenly another layer of truth that just opens up where we recognize, oh, well, even when I had the meta conversation, I assumed that the relationship was here, or I assumed that the person was ready to have this. And I recognized that, well, that was not the case. So it's this process of just peeling the layers and constant correction until we both arrive at a place where we can see each other and be able to talk. And then perhaps the outcome starts to manifest.
And even if it doesn't, what it's a show of continuous investment in the relationship.
So good.
So that is what you're doing. And not all investments reap immediate returns. Like it's a commitment to the relationship. It's an investment in that. And also the trajectory of that relationship is not a smooth line. It's jagged.
It's so true. And given the first example that you shared about what happened within the Upper team, what I so much appreciated was and to tie to the point of investment in the relationship, meta conversations is a very sure shot way of not letting the ego at any point in time take over our relationships and decision making.
I'm also realizing that I, in this moment, I think it's clear that I have the most ego on the team, which is why I need to have the most meta conversations.
I respectfully disagree with that.
Me too. Me too. And in you sharing and in this way with the public, to me, that's a sign of how you're working on that.
Well, this is very healing because it's a meta conversation about meta conversations, and I'm finding the process of talking about these examples and processing them with you both very healing for me. So
likewise.
Beautiful. And it just speaks to, when we go into a meta conversation, we're not dropping truth bombs on the other person about what they're doing. That's not what's such a critical piece of this. Is we really do need to speak about our own egos and our own insecurities and how that is a part of our experience, so that we take responsibility for what we're feeling and then also be able to share truthfully with how the other person is affecting us. Beautiful. Is there anything that either of you would want to share in closing?
The one thing I had in mind was we took this idea of pinch moments and we actually created a slide in our communication workshop for the rules of engagement around those pinch moments. And I'm wondering if it would be helpful if I just share these few bullet points just to make it really concrete. How does one go about this? Because like you said, it's not just dropping, hey, I'm just being honest here. I'm just telling you what you're doing. So how does one actually engage in a conversation like this? This is, again, Michael, you talked about the pinch moment being one particular flavor of a meta conversation. But I think in some ways, for me, there's almost a complete overlap, because typically when there's a need for a meta conversation, it's because I'm either feeling a pinch or I'm perceiving a pinch on the other side. Like there's some trigger that creates the need for the meta conversation. So what we say the rules of engagement is as soon as, well, first of all, it helps to have established what we talked about earlier, establish this as a practice that you want to have, whether that be in your domestic partnership or in your team in a professional setting, to establish the idea of a meta conversation and a pinch moment. And then as soon as you recognize that there is a pinch moment, you call it out. So what we would do on our team is say, hey, I'm feeling a pinch moment. And that was the indicator to everybody that we needed to talk about the dynamics of what's happening. And what we would do then is give the other person or other people a chance to respond. But whether they feel that pinch moment or not, the conversation gets paused. Because sometimes, like, what would happen is I would say, hey, I'm feeling a pinch here. And Michael and Rasanath, maybe the three of us are in a conversation, and you might be oblivious to that. It might be something that I'm just experiencing internally. Or it may be something that's obvious to all three of us, that tensions have risen and you're like, yeah, good idea. Let's pause the conversation. But I've been in other conversations where one person is experiencing something that the other people are oblivious to. So it helps to just check in, like, I'm feeling a pinch moment, and give you both a chance to respond saying, yeah, I'm sensing something as well, or I'm feeling that myself, or I'm not feeling it, but I'm sensing that pinch moment in you. So we just establish what's happening, and then we discuss the meta conversation or meta communication, the communication about the communication. We talk about the tone, the body language. And part of that is to start by, if I'm feeling the pinch moment, sharing what I'm experiencing, and then really seeking to understand and in doing that, taking responsibility. This is what I am going through. Not, hey, this is what you're doing to me. This is what my experience is. And then seeking to understand, Michael, what are you experiencing of this? Rasanath, what are you experiencing? And you may be experiencing something totally different, but sharing that. And for me to try to understand that before we go back to the original topic or the content. And sometimes that pinch moment is too charged. And so by the time we call it out, we're not actually ready to discuss. And so when that happens, we agree to discuss the meta communication, the meta conversation at another time, but we commit to doing that within 24 hours or 48 hours. So sometimes like we haven't had the awareness to call out the pinch moment early enough. And by the time we did, it's too heated. So we give ourselves the freedom to say, you know what, I'm not quite ready to talk about this right now. Can we do it tomorrow or the day after? And let's block out time to do that. So we respect each other's need to have the conversation when we're feeling ready to have the conversation. We still pause the content. And like Rasanath said, sometimes that's what gets in the way. Well, we still have to talk about this thing. We can't wait to talk about the topic, but the topic is not going to be effective if there's so much tension in the conversation. And then again, in a meta conversation, what we're investing in is understanding the intentions of the other person or other people and honestly sharing our own. So just some tips into how to have a conversation like this and what are some of the sort of quote rules of engagement.
Very, very helpful. And we'll try to put those bullets in the show notes so that everyone can get them by going there. Well, thank you guys for this conversation, for these mini meta conversations about our conversations. So much fun. And also, as you shared, Rasanath, it makes me feel so grateful to be a part of this team. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.